Hello, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, folks in the studio. Thank you, everybody watching out in the wonderful digital universe. And thank you, David Gray, for joining us today. On this, God, it looks even more wretched from in here than it's for those of you not in New York City. It's just a miserable day outside today. So you guys who are here, thank you extra for being here. So as mentioned, we're here on the occasion of the release of the best of David Gray, and I'm curious what in assembling a best of, what thoughts it brings up. What is it an opportunity for sort of reflection on a career and thinking about what this body of work is that you've created?
Yeah, this time around I think it was. It's 25 years since I recorded my first single, so that's a long time by anyone's reckoning. So I think I have taken stock, really, of the whole thing, and it's been interesting to go back to the beginning. I mean, when you listen back to your old records, they don't sound quite the way that you think they do. They're more human somehow, more vulnerable when you listen back, with years in between. So it's a strange experience. It's the miracle of recorded sound. You can go back and hear what it all sounded like. But yeah, this time around, I think on many levels, I've sort of taken the whole thing on board, what's happened and what's going to happen next, maybe too.
And what do you feel like you learn from that? How do you connect the dots as you go back and sort through all this?
Well, I think when you listen back to stuff as an artist, you're always sort of checking it. The first thing is just anxiety. Does it sound good? That's what's going through my head every time I hear a track, just like then when I was standing outside and I was hearing the single. I was just listening to, does the mix sound good? How does it hang together when you? And this
is one you've lived with recently, much less something from 20 years ago.
So it's generally just an anxious, is it okay? That's the first thought. Then you might actually start to enjoy it in some kind of way. So that's how it works in my head. It's not so much you listen for pleasure as just to check that it's all right.
Especially, I guess, the writing process changed over all of that time? I mean, when you stack these up next to each other, do you do this differently? Have how has that evolved or not over time?
It's changed a lot. I think when I began recording professionally, I was pretty sort of amateurish as a musician, certainly. I was sort of hammering my guitar, hammering my vocals, just hammering everything, hammering my manager, hammering the bar, and it was a different thing. The way I wrote was kind of impassioned. These days, I'm a little bit more detached about the whole process, for sure, and it was always usually melody. I'd get a chord sequence and a melody would come, and then I'd try and find a lyric, but it usually happened in that order. And they were quite narrative-driven. Obviously, the songs when I began were quite sort of Dylan-esque, I suppose, or Van Morrison or whatever. My influences were very much obvious. By the time I got to White Ladder, I'd sort of taken a few steps forward in terms of writing and recording. And the writing process at that point began to allow other people into it. So if you listen to tracks like Babylon, and Please Forgive Me, the soundscape and the fact that it's much more about rhythm and the sonics was because other people were involved from an earlier stage, and I was leaving more room in the music. When I began, I was nervous about letting people into the songs and changing the songs. It felt like it would be a compromise if someone made them posh in the studio when I wanted them to be kind of raw and direct. But as time went on, I began to see how essential it was to get other people's input, be they a producer or other musicians, And that's really when my writing process began to change, when I sort of managed to relax enough. It only took me about 6 or 7 years to let people get involved in a sort of bigger way. And these days, I've carried on from that, and now I write most of the time with other people around. So I'll go into the studio with no idea of what I'm going to do, really, apart from maybe a couple of lines that I've written down. So starting with a lyric rather than with music. And in this way, I find I manage to catch myself out, so it doesn't become important because I don't know what I'm doing until I've sort of done it. And then I can take stock afterwards. I find that self-consciousness is the biggest enemy, and when you've been making music and writing songs for a long time, there's a tendency, if I go downstairs to write, I'll start writing, and I'm immediately thinking, is this important? What's this about? I start asking myself all these questions that don't get you anywhere. Whereas when there are other people there and it becomes a vibe and someone comes up with a weird little drum loop or a weird keyboard sound or whatever it is, you just start to enjoy it and get into it. Then the lyrics will follow. And then afterwards, I can ask myself what it all adds up to. So that's one of the ways it's changed.
But it's fascinating that over time it's become less planned, more spontaneous. Is it a matter of sort of building up the confidence to be able to trust that?
Yeah, confidence has a lot to do with it. I think I'm much more secure in what I do, to feel that it's like if you jump, the net will appear sort of thing, that the music will somehow arrive. So yeah, I was very insecure about being in the studio, about the whole process really when I began. And these days I'm much more I'm on much stronger ground. So I can allow things to change around me. That's very much what it's about.
Particularly as you look back and put a project like this together, is there a song that stands out as a pivot point, as a really, transformative moment in the road? I mean, I think most would say Babylon was the song that sort of broke you to the world, but for you, creatively, do you look at that as a turning point, or is there something else that jumps out?
No, I think I'd have to say that White Ladder was the moment, not only commercially, but creatively, when I sort of escaped. It's almost like the gravitational pull of my influences, and I became something in my own right. And that was because of these factors as well, of like letting other people in. We were suddenly making a sound that, although obviously relative to songwriters that had come before, suddenly sounded like very much my thing. And a sound of the time, which was like the late 90s when we made that record. So as a writer and in every other way, I think that's when I found my feet and really began to run with it.
Take us back a little bit to that moment. I'm curious about it. These guys are probably younger enough that they don't remember, but I literally remember seeing you at South by Southwest in a little room maybe this size with a few dozen people there, and then, what seemed like a week or two later, Babylon was catching fire, and all of a sudden you were everywhere, and then another single, and how do you reflect back on, what seemed like a sort of very sudden propulsion into the spotlight?
Yeah, it wasn't sudden at all. It was slow, and it basically was a lot of legwork. That's what I remember. It was ludicrous. I mean, success is just a giant act of turning up. If your stars align and you're lucky enough that everything begins to go your way, we had the right album. There was a sense of inevitability about it after a certain point, because by the time it was starting to translate into something meaningful here, it had already done so in Ireland in a massive way, and we had that sense of belief that had given us. And in the UK, it was starting to really take hold. So we were seeing So you start to think, yeah, this is going to happen. We know the music's going to do the work. We've just got to go and make sure that we're there to support it. So what I remember about it was, playing crazy like tours where it was like 6 shows straight with 3 radio stations a day. You'd be up at sort of 7, someone would drag you stinking of vodka out of your bunk at sort of 7:30 in the morning. Come on, Dave, you've got to come and play Babylon. And that's what happened every day. So that's what I remember is all the promo.
And that went on for years. What was set in motion with White Ladder seemed uninterrupted for...
It was the White Ladder touring that record itself. We finished the record in '98. It came out in Ireland in November '98, the UK the beginning of '99, the US a little bit later that year. Then it was re-released in the UK on Warner's in 2000. We toured from November '98 until sort of the end of the summer 2001, so almost 3 years on the road with that record. So it was quite a journey, and yeah, like I say, it's a giant act of turning up. The world's catching up with you, and you've just got to make sure you're there.
We'll talk a bit about the difference between what it is to have a hit in the UK and what it is to have a hit in the States, and that I feel like it's gotten, sort of after Amy Winehouse, after Adele, things have opened up a bit, but it's still difficult. I mean, I was supposed to see Michael Kiwanuka this week, and there's somebody with a #1 album in the UK who can't get on the charts in the States, and it's still a really difficult transferal to, to make that leap across and still see that kind of success. What is that? What is it that distinguishes that?
Well, lots of reasons, and obviously it's partly down to the kind of music, or what works in the UK doesn't always work here. But you have to put a lot of effort in the States. You've got to go round. You've got to do it. You can't just turn up in New York and show your face. It's not like flying into London and sort of cracking Radio 1 and a couple of other sort of big stations, and suddenly the world's at your feet, or at least that's how it used to be. We're obviously living in a slightly more splintered age now, where the media isn't what it was, and radio isn't the sole driver of the equation, so things have changed. But yeah, for many reasons, which are sort of, some of them rather dull, like the fact that, sales in music have eroded to the point, well, it's sort of becoming embarrassing, the numbers that you sell of records now. So that it's all about streaming or other ways of listening to content. So without the money that provided as tour support for small up-and-coming acts to come over here is very, very expensive, simply. And you're just going to lose a load of money. So you've got to be pretty damn sure that you're going to succeed. And I think that's a lot to do with it. But it's also, people think because the language is the same, that it's just going to be a matter of us coming over and everyone will get it. But it's quite a different culture here. It does depend on the artist. Obviously, you've had Ed Sheeran, James Bay, people like that, and Adele, as you mentioned. And maybe they're a bit more fleet of foot. So Ed, obviously, does his own thing on his own, so the perfect scenario, really, and is also just a ridiculous workhorse. He'll do anything. It's like 50 gigs in a row, yes, please. That's exactly the kind of artist that is going to make it. And also maybe he's got the right sound and the right vibe, and it's sort of easy to translate, whereas more sort of idiosyncratic British music doesn't necessarily come over so easily.
So yeah, of course, a big piece of all of it is the touring piece, and you've been bouncing around the country right now. I didn't realize there was a West Coast and back trip within the last few days. How is putting a collection like this, how is putting a best of set differ from putting a set list together? I mean, it seems like that's the other time that you would look across all of your work and figure out how to assemble it. Is it the same sort of thing, or is it a different thing?
I guess picking the songs for the record was obviously most of them picked themselves. There was some variation, perhaps reflecting some of the new technology, some of the information. You can see exactly which songs are getting played the most in the world of streaming, and that's sometimes surprising. So some things were chosen because we can see that they register in the world of online streaming. They get a lot of listens. So Only the Wine is one track that's been included precisely for that reason. So that made the whole thing a little bit more interesting. That track gets a huge amounts of streams, and I think we're not quite sure why, but we think because it's playlisted, some influential playlist has held it as a track, and then it gets copied, and I presume then it becomes a thing in its own, and that the playlist is like a buzzword of the last few years. And I think that's been responsible. So that's, anyway, we let them, obviously all the main tracks are there pretty much. You can't include everything, so we left a few things off and included some of these other tracks which seem to be well listened to at the moment for whatever reason. I mean, I think it's not an exact science putting together a compilation. What you're doing is you're gathering what you consider to be the sort of highlights package together at a given moment. And it's really for someone to come to who maybe isn't such a big fan. Obviously, you might have hardcore fans who buy a record because there's a couple of new tracks on it and there's some new recordings of some of the old stuff. But it's a way of, they might know White Ladder and they might know The One I Love, and then by listening through, they might hear some things that they hadn't heard before, and a light on an album perhaps that's worth checking out, and then they'll get into a bit more depth with it. I don't know.
But then I'm curious, how does that factor then into the set list side and the live performance side and choosing what you're going to play?
Well, the set list part is slightly different, but I think that God, I've forgotten what I was going to say now.
That's what I get for interrupting.
I think with my set lists, I've chosen to take the tour that I'm doing. I've gone back to playing solo, which is how I began sort of all those years ago. So it suddenly felt right, and it felt like there was some space for movement there. Then it would leave me free to play any song at the drop of a hat in a way. So I've learned so I've tried to go really deep. It's like a sort of retrospective, really, the live set, with obviously a lot of the hits in, but I've tried to play songs off every album. So what I've been playing live since I arrived a couple of weeks ago is a real fan set. And that's been quite amazing, really, to really start playing the old songs in earnest, and whole groups of songs off albums that I haven't played for ages. It was quite emotional to get back into the music, because they're as a record of your life, whether they're autobiographical or not is neither here nor there. They all bear the emotional imprint of what's happened to you. And it's like, songs are like photos you can walk into and shake everyone's hand and start talking to them. As I sort of start singing the songs again and re-inhabit the sort of emotional space, that ghosts come out the walls. You remember recording them, you remember people there, you remember things that happened, you remember gigs, you remember the tour bus, you remember this. You have these massive flashbacks. It's like a time tunnel. It's crazy.
And as you mentioned, there's 2 new songs on this set. Was that you went in and wrote 2 new songs and said, let's just put something new that's on? Were these things that you went back to? Did you think about how these fit within what this set is, or are these just, here's a couple of things that I liked?
They were finished, and they seemed to hold their own. And I recorded both the new tracks, Enter Lightly and Smoke Without Fire, with Andy Barlow, who made Mutineers. And the sort of loose plan was that as soon as I got off the road with the Mutineers tour, we were going to go back into the studio and start making another record, where we began, but then he got sucked into a project that there was no way out of. So it was obvious that we weren't going to make this next record together. But we'd already made a start, and we'd finished these 2 things. So it felt like they were the right things to put on the record. And they do, I wouldn't call them singles, but they do have a strength and a sort of, and they make sense relative to what happened on the last album. So that it felt right, and yeah, that's why.
And then last thing I'm going to ask, then we'll look to questions for you guys, so think about what it is you're asking David here. I know you're already sort of ankle deep into the next thing that
I'd say probably knee or even
maybe
thigh
knee
deep.
deep. Yeah.
Definitely above the ankle at this point.
Anything to say about the direction that you're seeing the new songs going, and are these affected, do you think, by going back and sifting through the old stuff, or is it its own momentum?
This isn't affected by that, because everything I've made of the new record I made prior to this whole sort of best of experience. So it's the most sort of up kind of collection of songs that I think I've done. They're very energized. It's very hard to write sort of up music without it seeming cheesy. So you can't force it. But I'm always happy when a song with some tempo and buoyancy sort of actually turns up. So if I chose like a great example of a sort of very up but non-cheesy song, it would be Please Forgive Me or Babylon, something that's got some tempo. So I've continued along, I guess, a more studio, but it's basically me playing over the top of ideas and then messing with the sound. So it's got sort of electronic aspects to it. It's hard to describe, obviously, but there's a lightness there, and yet I'm still pleased that there's a gravity to the actual writing. I know all the songs were written in the way that I described, so very, very spontaneously, just in the studio, gathering out of nothing almost, and then happening incredibly quickly. And I love to work in the spur of the moment like that. I think that when you sing a song for the first time, you capture something that's slightly bigger than yourself, if you're lucky. It's that you haven't worked out what it is that you're doing yet, and you're just filling that space. You're like blowing a balloon up with the emotion. Whereas it becomes acting very quickly as soon as you know what you're doing. So I'm really excited about the new stuff. The way that we've made it and the joy that I've had in making it, I feel will translate to the listener. So very, very excited about that.
Okay, so let's go to you guys, and I guess right down front.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, thanks.
I was wondering, do you ever get writer's block? And if so, how do you combat that?
Yeah, I think writer's block is, I've never had it, no, but I know what it is. I know the look on its face. The process I've described, whereby I go into the studio and work in the way that I do, is precisely to sidestep those sort of blocking thoughts, because essentially it's just becoming self-conscious and doubting the worth of what you're doing, the integrity of what you're doing, whatever it is. Why is this important? Why should it take place? Why does the world need another song from me? And what is it that's happened to me that's so interesting that I need to sing about it? All these thoughts could come into your mind, and they could just quickly close down the whole point of even making a song. Well, I've written 100 or more. Why should I write any more? But I don't think music is a bountiful thing, as far as I can tell, and it just keeps coming. So it's a very real thing. I think if I've been touring, the closest thing I have to writer's block is the hardest part is the lyrics. So that's what I associate with writer's block. So if I've been away for 12 months on the road, I might have written a few tunes, and I might have made some notes, but I won't have written a song, generally. And when I come back then, I have not written a song now since 18 months and counting. That's when the writer's block thing comes in. And there's no easy way around it, but what I would do is, if I get any idea, even if it's just the simplest, most insignificant tune, I'll try and complete it. Anything to gain any
just to get started.
Creative momentum. And then after a couple of successes, you'll suddenly find you're not thinking that way. But it's very real anyway. Writer's block is there, but I have the confidence in music as a sort of, that it just keeps coming if you have an open heart and you make yourself available for it. So I've found my technique for combating the self-consciousness that closes you down. But it's a real thing. It could conquer me at some point in the future, I suppose.
Go to right there.
Hey, David. Thank you for being here. What's the concept of the Enter Lightly music video, and where do you keep the painting today?
Yeah. I'm not a big fan of making music videos, poncing about lip syncing. So I decided this time that I'd make a painting, which is what I used to do a long time ago, and I haven't made one since. And every few years I'd tell myself the lie that I'm going to start painting again. I don't know why it hasn't happened yet. I think it's just time, space, mess, lots of practical reasons. And the fact I put more and more into the music, I suppose, leaves less and less room for other things. But so my concept was partly because I wanted to kickstart myself into making something visual. And because it sounded like fun, I just said, why don't I just make a painting? So rather than paint someone's portrait or something which could have gone horribly wrong, I thought I'd kind of do a Jackson Pollock kind of thing. So it was actually great fun, but the solvents that we were using, because Pollock used like enamel paint, essentially sort of industrial paint, the solvents that you use to thin the paint down so you can really skit it around were incredibly powerful. I mean, like crazy. So I've got a bit of a solvent problem now.
And so where's the painting right now?
The painting is, I'm not sure, I think it's in the office somewhere. Yeah, we were going to put it up online, see if anyone wanted to buy it. There's 2 paintings, because I bought so much paint, I didn't know how much I'd need. I overbought by about 92%, I'd say. I had these giant jars of paint, massive cans. So we did one painting from like morning till early afternoon. And then I put so much paint onto it that it couldn't support any more paint, and I had to stop. So then I got another canvas out, and I did that. So I did 2 paintings that day. So they're both at the office, I think, waiting for something to happen to them. We could cut them up and people could buy bits.
Many opportunities for revenue. Down here.
Hi, David.
Hi.
I came to White Ladder in about 2000, and even when they played it this morning, and I heard Babylon, I was really moved. I love your music. Okay, I'm being weepy. So since I heard you were coming here, I've been trying to tell everybody about your music, but I don't know how to describe it. How do you want, I don't want to use the word genre unless you do, but how do I describe it? What do I say?
Just listen to it, I suppose.
But I asked a lot of people, and people didn't know your name, so I wanted to.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not much help at these things. I mean, it's sort of, I guess it's acoustic pop music, although that doesn't sound very descriptive, does it? I don't know. I mean, pop. I can't help. I can't give you a really concise one-liner to describe it. I don't know. You've just got to listen to it, I suppose.
Do you think in those terms at all? Or do you think in terms of your peers or your aspirations, or, is there anything that kind of frames up what you're doing, or you just put your head down and barrel ahead?
Well, in terms of sounds, I like let's say the voicings of the music. I don't feel like it's enough most of the time to just play a song on an acoustic guitar. I want to do something that's going to make me think about that differently. So I'm looking for ways to change the sound and make myself interested. I love electronic music. I love the way that it messes with sound. I love the creativity in all kinds of sort of urban music, just the way that sound is used very disrespectfully, really. Means to an end. So I'm fascinated. I don't hold to a tradition, and I don't think things need to be held up and respected, like the integrity of folk music or this, that. I think everything's in a constant state of flux, and that's not the essence of music at all. So I think even though I'll change the way that I voice the songs and I change the way I approach it, it might be more electronic, it might be more bandy, more rocky, might be more stripped back. I think that it still has my hallmark each time. It can't help but bear the hallmark of the way that I write and the way that I think, and the sort of emotional agenda that I've got that I want to impart. That's what sort of comes across. That's what's common to all the songs. So.
I have one more right there.
Hi, David. I was just wondering, what do you do as an individual to sort of maintain that individual artistry that makes your music so unique?
Well, I guess, how do I keep myself interested in what I'm doing? I think I got to the point a few records ago where I felt like I'd used up a particular kind of idea, and I needed to sort of start all over again. And Mutineers was a bit of a challenge, the last record. in terms of breaking away from the kind of way of thinking almost. But it was quite liberating and energizing to really challenge my working processes in the way that I did on that record. And coming out the other side of it, I could sense that there were all kinds of worlds of possibilities in terms of how to make a song, what a song might even be. So I just try and keep myself alive to musical possibilities. So for example, one thing that would change would be that I've written a few songs based on other people's words, and then I began to just hear music that was latent in conversation even. So just something that someone would say on the bus and the rhythm in which they'd say it, and think, well, that could be a song. Well, that's a completely new zone for me. I've never even thought about that. So I just try and keep alive to possibilities, because even just something as small and apparently fairly insignificant as a discovery like that could lead to a massive reassessment of what I'm up to. So I just try and keep alive to changes and keep my working processes kind of more and more open. That's where I've ended up. So I'm stepping away from narrative. I'm more into just hanging images in succession within a sort of sonic creation. Sort of that's my idea of writing a song now, that people will make it make their own sense. That's where I've ended up. I'm not really answering your question, am I? I don't know. I keep challenging my own status quo in terms of how I write and how I make things, because I want to be surprised. You know, I could just go and make songs on the acoustic guitar ad infinitum, ad nauseum, but I don't want to do that. I want to find a new way of expressing. So I listen to artists that do challenge the norm, and I find inspiration there.
All right, our time is up. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here. For everybody watching, The Best of David Gray is out right now, and thank you from all of us to David Gray.
Thank you.